awful. Still, nothing but death could stop that renowned infantry. We had to fight against tremendous odds. At the top of the hill, our colonel exclaimed when he sounded the assembly, "Where's my poor old Fusiliers? My God, my God." And he cried like a child, wringing his hands.
Despite the harrowing losses, the Fusiliers took the Russian gun position. The gentry on the hill ran for cover, and Prince Menshikov ordered the retreat.
Our army was utterly routed and beaten out of an almost unassailable position. I asked the commander of our battalion where we were going, but even the major didn't know. He had no orders where to go. We all stared at each other and wondered where we should find ourselves. We were like a flock of lost sheep without a shepherd. Captain Khodasevich, Tarutin Regiment.
That evening, William Howard Russell walked across the fields above the River Alma.
One who has not seen cannot conceive the relics of a great fight, especially on such a field as that of the Alma. There was an immense accumulation of camp litter on the hillsides. There was a sickening, sour, fetid smell everywhere, and the grass was sloppy with blood.
The exhausted troops dispersed.
We went into the vineyards and got some grapes. These were the first grapes we'd seen. From there, we went into the village which the enemy had burnt. Here, the surgeons had established a field hospital, several of whom were hard at work amputating limbs. There was a large heap of detached limbs lying in the yard, and many poor fellows waiting their turn. Private Albert Mitchell.
The young soldiers who died at Alma had opened up the road to Sevastopol, but the generals did not take it. They decided to march their army in a different direction, a decision that would lead to hundreds of thousands more deaths on the shores of the Crimea. The Allied army had decided to march around Sevastopol and attack it from the south, using the harbour of Balaclava to bring ashore all the equipment needed to mount a proper siege. The man responsible for this disastrous move was Raglan's chief strategist, General Burgoyne. He was 71 years old and argued the only way to take a fortified city was to do it by the book. Bring up the big guns and knock down the fortifications. This would take weeks. Some Allied commanders were horrified by this delay. Looking down on Sevastopol, General Sir George Cathcart could see it was an easy target.
I'm sure I could walk into it with scarcely the loss of a man, at night or an hour before day. We could leave our packs and run into it even in open daylight, only risking a few shots from their gun positions. We see people walking about the streets in great consternation.
In the town, the people were as busy as ants, working day and night at their defenses. In fact, all seemed to be seized with a kind of panic. Admiral Kornilov appeared to have a power of multiplying himself, for he was everywhere, promising large rewards to all if they could only keep the town. Captain Khodasevich, Tarutin Regiment.
The problem facing the Russian naval commanders was not just how to defend Sevastopol from the land, but also how to prevent the Allied fleet attacking from the sea.
The naval commanders were highly intelligent. They quickly saw that they had no role on sea once the French and British navies had arrived. The Allies were overwhelmingly superior. So what they did was to sink some of their ships in a way to block a direct Allied naval assault on Sevastopol, and to land most of the crews. And the crews from the naval units, excellently commanded by the admirals, and with morale very high, formed the backbone of the defence.
The British and French had travelled 2,000 miles to sink the Black Sea Fleet. Now the Russian Navy had done the job themselves. Meanwhile, the Allied army had completed their march around Sevastopol. Just 6 days after storming the heights of Alma, they arrived in Balaclava. From now on, this cramped harbour was the centre of British army activity in the Crimean War. Its name would become synonymous with terrible suffering and extraordinary courage. For the Rifle Brigade, arriving in Balaclava meant a well-earned rest.
I've been sleeping in the open air with my clothes on now for 19 days. Sickness prevails to a great extent, so our company is reduced from 143 to 70. You must tender my kindest love to Sarah and ask her how she would like to see her brother come home with one leg. I fancy I should be a comical fellow. But without joking, I thought I would be shot in 50 places at Alma. It is curious work to be dodging cannonballs all day. I hope I shall be as lucky in the next affair. Your affectionate brother, Harry Blishen.
As the British made their base in Balaclava, the French organised themselves a few miles away in the more spacious harbour at Camiche. Both armies got on with building up their siege operations.
Clearly the biggest mistake the Allies made in the entire Crimean campaign was to march around Sevastopol and attempt to set up a regular siege. This allowed the Russians to bring in their excellent field engineers and to call up the guns from the naval dockyard. The two armies then set about digging themselves ever deeper into trench systems which look remarkably like the Western Front.
The Allies continued to help the Russians by wasting time. It took them 3 weeks to bring their big guns into position. By the time Fanny Jubilee turned up, the British hadn't yet managed to open fire, but they had attracted the attention of the Russian gunners.
About 1,000 yards from us lay the forts of Sevastopol. The shot and shell came hissing every 2 minutes. We were standing on the brow of a hill, backed by our magnificent troops and fronting the enemy, the doomed city beneath our feet. It was indeed a moment worth 100 years of everyday existence.
The first day of the Allied bombardment was a spectacular affair, but the Russians had used those wasted weeks to very good effect.
From 6 until 9 a.m. they were hard at it. As fast as our men could load and fire, it was ding-dong hard fighting. At 9 a.m., one of the French magazines went up with a crash. As far as we could see, it was all fair give and take. Sergeant Timothy Gowing.
The opening bombardment failed to demolish Sevastopol. Now the initiative swung to the Russians. They decided to counterattack before the Allies could secure their base at Balaclava. Early on the morning of October the 25th, a Russian army of 30,000 descended from the north. Their aim was to cut the line of communication between the siege forces round Sevastopol and the supply base at Balaclava. Fanny Jubilee was asleep on board ship when her husband sent word.
A note was put into my hands from Henry. It ran thus: "The Battle of Balaclava has begun and promises to be a hot one. Lose no time, but come as quickly as you can. Do not wait for breakfast."
Between these woods in the foreground and the hills at the back is the Valley of Death, where the Battle of Balaclava was fought. At dawn, the Russian army launched a surprise attack on Balaclava's first line of defense, Allied gun positions manned by some 900 Turkish soldiers. The Turks held out as long as they could before abandoning their guns and fleeing towards the port. Galloping the other way came Fanny Jubilee, heading for the sound of gunfire.
The road was almost blocked by flying Turks. vociferating, "Ship, Johnny," while others came along laden with pots, kettles, arms and plunder. The Russians were by this time in possession of 3 batteries from which the Turks had fled.
What's often forgotten is that those Turks, probably less than 1,000 men, had been holding out for a good 2 hours against immensely superior Russian forces. Men like Lord Raglan, the British commander, Russell, the Times correspondent, arrived on the battlefield only at the end of the Turks' 2-hour resistance. And so the initial impression was one simply of the Turks running away.
Lord Raglan and his staff climbed the hill above the valley to get a better view of the action. They could see the next line of defence guarding the port of Balaclava, the 93rd Highlanders, commanded by Sir Colin Campbell. He formed them up into a thin red line and gave them their orders as an advanced force of Russian cavalry rode towards them.
Men, remember there is no retreat from here. You must die where you stand.
William Howard Russell watched from above, waiting for the Russians to make a move.
The silence is oppressive. Between the cannon bursts, one can hear the champing of bits and the clink of sabres in the valley below. The Russians drew breath for a moment and then in one grand line dashed at the Highlanders. The ground flies beneath their horses' feet. Gathering speed at every stride, they dash on towards that thin red streak tipped with a line of steel.
The thin red line had held. The Russian cavalry retreated, and on the hillside, the onlookers cheered the Highlanders. But it was a brief respite. The main force of Russian cavalry was still advancing towards Balaclava. Lord Raglan turned to the Heavy Brigade under the command of General Sir James Scarlett. Scarlett had never been in a battle before in his life. Now he ordered his 300 men to charge uphill straight into 2,000 enemy cavalry. The artist who painted this battle tidied up the scene for the public back home, but William Howard Russell would see it was a vicious struggle.
God help them, they are lost, was the exclamation of more than one man. By sheer steel and sheer courage, Enniskillen and Scott were winning their desperate way right through the enemy's squadrons. Then, with irresistible force, like one bolt from a bow, the rest of the Heavy Brigade rushed at the remnants of the first line of the enemy, went through it as though it were made of pasteboard, and put them to utter rout.
The British had done well to have held off such a large Russian force. The valley was strewn with the casualties of battle, and both sides may have been ready to call it a day. But fate had one more cruel card to play. Lord Raglan could see the Russian army towing away the guns abandoned by the Turks. To lose the guns was tantamount to losing the battle. Someone had to stop them. He sent an order to the Light Brigade, which would send them charging in the wrong direction, towards death and immortality.
The opening of the Churchill Museum and the 40th anniversary of his death, we're sponsoring a special series of lectures. For your chance to win tickets to one of them, visit uktvhistory.co.uk or press red on your digital satellite remote.
On October the 25th, 1854, a simple bugle call sent 600 men of the British cavalry riding into history.
I am Trumpeter Lamprey, one of the surviving trumpeters in charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava. I am now going to sound the charge as was sounded at Ballast.